The sea around Skerryvore had its own voice. It never sounded the same twice. Some days it whispered, brushing gently against the black stone reefs as if offering a truce. Other days it roared like a beast waking from an ancient sleep. On that morning, when the story truly began, it murmured, low, steady, almost thoughtful, as if it, too, was trying to understand the war spreadin'. Tom McLeary stood alone on the gallery platform high above the water, his hands gripping the cold iron rail. He was a tall man, though the years had curved his shoulders slightly, as if the wind itself had leaned on him too many times. His beard was the color of storm foam, and the deep creases around his eyes looked carved rather than grown. He watched the horizon with the solemn patience of someone who had long accepted that the world rarely changed for the better. Below him, the lighthouse rose like a single white thong from the reef. Skerryvore had always been a place of danger. Countless ships had been destroyed on these rocks long before the Germans ever looked toward Britain. The tower had been built to defy both nature and fate. But inside it lived only 3 men, and even their resolve sometimes trembled. Behind Tom, the door creaked open. "Cold morning," Gavin Doyle said, stepping out. His voice carried a mixture of caution and eagerness. Gavin was young, only 24, with hair the color of wet sand and eyes that always seemed to search for something, a sign, a meaning, a mission. He pulled his coat tighter as the wind bit at his sleeves. Tom didn't look at him. "They all are this time of year," Tom said, his tone steady. Gavin walked closer to the railing, his boots clanking on the metal grate. "Still, the sea looks calmer than yesterday. That's something." "It's not calm," Tom replied. "It's resting. And when the sea rests, you should worry. It means it's gathering its strength." Gavin blew into his hands for warmth. A gull glided past them, tilted by the wind, and vanished behind the lighthouse. Inside the tower, Hector McInnes was banging a wrench against a stubborn valve. Hector had a way of turning every maintenance task into a conversation with the machinery. Sometimes he scolded it. Sometimes he encouraged it. Today, judging by the noise, he was accusing it of personal betrayal. Tom exhaled long and slow. Another day in isolation. Another day guarding the light. Another day listening to a war they could not see, except for the distant glow on the mainland, where bombs sometimes fell like dying stars. The 3 men gathered in the kitchen at midday. The kitchen was narrow, with curved stone walls and a single round window that framed the sea like a painting. Hector set a pot of tea on the table, steam curling upward like a ghost stretching its arms. "Valves fixed," Hector said, wiping his hands on a rag. "Though I'm not convinced it won't betray us again tonight. Machines don't like the storm air. Makes them nervous." "Machines can't be nervous," Gavin said, half smiling. "I've met engineers more nervous than machines," Hector shot back, pouring the tea. "So yes, machines can be nervous. They just hide it better." Tom sipped his tea without reacting. His silence wasn't cold, it was simply how he preserved his energy. Everything about Tom was economy of words, of movements, of emotion. Gavin leaned forward. "I picked up some radio chatter last night. Planes returning toward the mainland. Sounded rough." Tom set his mug down. "It usually is these days." Gavin swallowed. "One of them said they were struggling with a damaged engine. And I don't know if they made it back." Tom looked at him, and for a moment his expression softened. "Only a moment. Gavin, you can't save pilots with worry." "I know," Gavin said, though his voice betrayed the truth. Hector sat down with his own cup. "You're not the first to feel that way out here. But we're not the RAF. We're not the Coast Guard. We're lighthouse men. That's all." Gavin nodded, but he didn't look satisfied. Because in his heart, he believed being a lighthouse keeper should mean more. That night the wind began to rise again. It started with a long sighing moan, then built into a restless howl that wrapped around the tower. Rain slapped against the glass panes of the lantern room like thrown pebbles. The rotating beam of light swept over the water, slicing through the dark like a sword. Tom stood beside the massive lamp, checking the mechanisms. He never trusted calm nights, but he trusted stormy nights even less. Storms could shake the tower so violently that dust poured from the ceiling, and even the thick stone walls groaned like old bones. Gavin climbed the final steps to the lantern room, breathless. "Radio's active," he said. "Heavy traffic. Sounds like there's trouble over the channel." Tom didn't respond immediately. He finished tightening a bolt, then wiped his hands and walked with Gavin down one level to the radio room. Static filled the air. Sharp bursts of noise. Voices cutting in and out like ghosts shouting from another world. "Returning to base, flames, losing altitude. Can't see anything, need compass bearing. Skerryvore light, do you copy? Engine failing." Gavin's hand trembled slightly as he adjusted the dials. The storm outside whipped the tower. Rain hammered the walls. Tom listened closely, his eyes narrowing. Another voice came through, frightened but trying to stay controlled. "This is Falcon 2, position uncertain, coastal lights invisible, request bearing." Tom leaned forward. "Answer him," Tom said. Gavin clicked the transmitter. "Falcon 2, this is Skerryvore Lighthouse. Your signal is weak but we hear you. Can you give altitude?" Static crackled. "Dropping, 600 feet, maybe less." Hector appeared in the doorway, his hair disheveled from the climb. "What's happening?" "A plane in trouble," Gavin said, though the words were hardly necessary. Tom spoke to Gavin quietly but firmly. "Keep him talking. Tell him to head north-northeast. He may catch sight of the mainland." Gavin nodded, though his throat worked as he swallowed. "Falcon 2, he said into the mic, turn north-northeast. Can you confirm?" Another long burst of static. "Trying, engine almost. God." Then silence. The radio hissed. The tower creaked. The wind wailed. Hector lowered his head. Gavin stared at the receiver as if willing it to speak again. Tom closed his eyes briefly. "That's all we can do." Gavin looked at him sharply. "That's not enough." Tom kept his calm. "We gave him direction. That's the job." "No," Gavin said, his voice cracking, "the job is to keep people alive." "The job," Tom repeated, "is to keep the light burning so others can find their way. We are not rescuers." Gavin slammed his hand against the table, making the radio jump. "But we should be. Why are we out here if we can't help the dying?" Tom's eyes hardened. Not in anger, in pain. Because sometimes keeping the light burning is all the help the world will let you give. Gavin had no reply. Not then. The three men stood in a flickering glow of the lamp, surrounded by storm noises and static. The lighthouse felt smaller than usual. Or perhaps the world outside had grown too dark. The storm lasted nearly 2 days. During that time the men barely slept. Tom checked the lamp every hour, even though the mechanism was sturdy and unlikely to fail. Hector inspected the engine room repeatedly, tightening bolts, muttering to himself. Gavin stayed near the radio, headphones on, listening to the chaos unfolding far beyond their reach. There were more distress calls. Some pilots sounded calm. Others sounded terrified. Some voices cut out abruptly. Others faded slowly, like candles losing wick. Through it all, Tom reminded Gavin again and again. We cannot leave the tower. Not in this storm. Not ever without orders. But each reminder dug deeper into Gavin's heart like a splinter. By the end of the storm, all three men were pale with exhaustion. Yet the lighthouse still stood. The light still spun. And the war still raged on the horizon. Then, early in the morning on the third day, when the storm finally loosened its grip, Gavin made a decision that would change everything. He went down to the boat room. Tom found him 10 minutes later, struggling with the ropes that kept their small rescue boat tied to the wall. Tom's voice cut through the damp air. "What do you think you're doing?" Tom asked. Gavin didn't turn around. "I'm going out there." "No, you're not," Tom said, walking forward. "I have to," Gavin insisted. "There were pilots calling for help last night. Maybe some survived. Maybe someone's out there on a raft. Maybe they're gone," Tom interrupted. "And if you take that boat out in these conditions, you'll be gone too." Gavin spun around, eyes blazing. "At least I'll have tried." Tom's jaw tightened. "Trying is not the same as saving. You know that." Hector appeared in the doorway, wiping grease from his hands. "What's happening?" "Gavin thinks he's the Navy," Tom said. "I think I'm a human being," Gavin exclaimed. "We can't just sit here listening to people die." Tom stepped forward until he stood directly in front of him. "You think I enjoy it? You think I haven't heard hundreds of voices, men, women, children, calling for help I can't give? I've done this job 20 years. Don't talk to me about sitting and doing nothing." Gavin's anger melted into something more fragile. "Then why won't you let me go?" Tom's answer was quiet. "Because your life is worth something. And because this tower needs all three of us alive to keep the light burning. Without that light, even more will die." The silence that followed was heavy, like the air before a storm. Finally Gavin slumped, the fight draining out of him. I just want to help someone." Tom put a hand on his shoulder. "I know. And you will. Just not like this." Gavin nodded reluctantly. Tom reached past him and retied the boat ropes himself, pulling the knots tight enough to hold through another storm. That night the weather calmed at last. The sea was still rough, but its fury had passed. The three men gathered in the lantern room again. The sky was cloudy but no longer violent. The radio was strangely quiet. Hector looked out over the dark water. "Feels like the world's catching its breath." Tom made a noncommittal sound. Gavin stood at the far window, staring into the blackness as if expecting someone to appear. And then he saw something. "Tom," Gavin said, his voice tight. "There's debris on the rocks." Tom followed his gaze. Sure enough, the moonlight caught something bobbing near the reef: wood, metal, scraps of canvas. The remains of some aircraft. Gavin's throat tightened. He said nothing, but his knuckles whitened on the window frame. Tom closed his eyes briefly, then put a hand on Gavin's shoulder. "We'll check it when the tide lowers. For now, we wait." Gavin nodded silently. They all knew what they might find in the morning. And none of them slept that night. The morning came slowly, as if the sun itself hesitated to rise over the lonely lighthouse. Pale light crept across the lantern room, dimming the rotating beam until Tom finally switched it off. For the first time in days, the storm clouds had thinned. The air was cold but clear, filled with the scent of wet stone and salt. Gavin was awake before either of the others. He had spent most of the night in and out of shallow sleep, dreaming of radio voices calling his name. When dawn finally reached the tower, he was already at the window, staring at the remains scattered on the black reef. Tom joined him a few minutes later. His footsteps were soft, but the weight in them was unmistakable. "You slept at all?" Tom asked. "Not really," Gavin replied, his eyes still fixed on the wreckage. Tom hummed thoughtfully. "We'll go down soon. Tide's still high, though. Give it another hour." Gavin nodded, but restlessness radiated from him like heat from a lantern. Hector appeared last, yawning loudly as he entered. His hair looked like it had surrendered to the night completely. "If anyone's wondering," Hector said, "I slept like a log. A wet, uncomfortable log being thrown down a rocky hill, but still. Even Tom allowed himself a faint smile. By the time the tide had retreated, the rocks were slick but exposed. Pools of seawater shimmered in broken pockets among the black stone. The three men climbed carefully down the iron ladder fixed to the side of the lighthouse, boots clanging against the rungs. The wind was calmer than it had been in days, but waves still crashed sharply against the outer reef, sending spray high into the air. The wreckage was not from a ship. Even from a distance they could see the metal plating, the curved frame, the shorn fabric of wings. "A fighter plane," Hector murmured, stepping closer. "British model, looks like a hurricane." Gavin crouched beside a twisted section of fuselage. His breath caught. The metal smelled faintly of fuel and seaweed. Tom scanned the rocks. No sign of a parachute. Hector sighed. "Let's hope he bailed out earlier." Gavin didn't answer. A tightness had settled in his chest, squeezing each breath. The idea that the pilot might have survived the crash had carried him through the night, but the cold reality of the scene before him made hope feel thin, almost childish. Tom noticed. "Don't assume the worst," Tom said quietly. "Wreckage drifts. Storms move things." But Gavin could hear the doubt beneath the reassurance. The three continued searching. They found a dented fuel tank, strips of torn canvas, a leather strap from a flight harness. Nothing more. Nothing human. Hector rubbed the back of his neck. "Sea must have taken him." Tom nodded grimly. "Let's head in. Tide's turning again." Gavin didn't move. Tom looked at him. "Gavin." "Just another minute," Gavin said, staring at the waves. Tom hesitated, then gestured to Hector. "Go on ahead. I'll stay with him." Hector nodded and carefully climbed back toward the lighthouse. Tom stood beside Gavin, silent for a long moment. The surf hissed and boomed around them. Then Gavin spoke. "He was talking to us," Gavin said, barely above a whisper. "Last night." One of the voices, it could have been him. Tom didn't deny it. He simply folded his arms and looked out over the water. "I keep thinking," Gavin continued, "if I'd told him something else, a different direction, or if we tried the boat." Tom cut him off gently. "No. This isn't on you." Gavin's jaw tightened. "But we didn't even try." Tom's voice softened, but not with pity, with understanding. "If we had taken that boat out, the storm would have eaten us alive. And 3 dead men saved no one." Gavin swallowed hard. "Then what are we supposed to do, Tom? Just keep the light on and hope it's enough?" Tom exhaled. "That's the job. It always has been." Gavin looked down at the water swirling between the rocks. "Sometimes it feels like nothing." Tom placed a hand on his shoulder. "Only to the ones still alive. To the ones out there in the dark. It's everything." The two stood in silence, listening to the sea. Eventually the tide forced them back. Later that afternoon, when the tide had gone out even further, Hector went outside once more to collect a few stray pieces of the wreckage before they drifted away. Tom and Gavin remained inside, tending to maintenance tasks that felt unusually heavy. Tom checked the oil reserves for the lamp. Gavin swept the stone floors of the lower level, though there was little to sweep. Each man worked quietly, lost in his thoughts. Then Hector's voice echoed from outside. "Tom. Gavin. You'll want to see this." Tom set down the oil can at once. Gavin nearly dropped the broom. Both rushed to the door and climbed down the ladder again. Hector stood near a shallow pool between the rocks, pointing. "There," Hector said, crouching. "Look." Something glinted in the water. Tom knelt and reached in. His hand emerged holding a small glass bottle, sealed with a cork. Inside was a piece of folded paper. Gavin's breath hitched. Tom turned the bottle over slowly, examining it. The glass was scratched and cloudy, but intact. Salt water sloshed inside. "Wasn't here earlier," Tom said. "Must have been caught under a rock and freed by the tide." "Open it," Gavin said, almost pleading. Tom nodded and eased the cork free. A faint musty smell drifted out. He shook the bottle gently until the paper slid into his palm. It was damp but readable. He unfolded it. Hector leaned close. Gavin stood perfectly still, afraid to breathe. Tom read the words aloud. "We saw your light. Thank you." The three men stared at the message. It was simple. Just 6 words. But it struck deeper than any speech could. Gavin felt something warm break inside him, not joy, not relief, but a kind of release. As if the weight he'd been carrying had cracked just enough for a little light to seep through. Hector exhaled a long, shaky breath. "Well," Hector said, "I suppose that answers the question." Tom closed his eyes for a moment. When he opened them again, the usual hardness was gone, replaced by something gentler. He folded the paper carefully and held it to his chest. "Someone out there," Tom said quietly, "saw this tower before the end. And it meant something to them." Gavin swallowed hard. "So, the pilot, he wasn't alone." Tom nodded. "No. Not alone." Hector brushed a hand over his stubbled jaw. "Light might not save everyone," Hector said, "but it saves someone. And maybe that's enough." Gavin blinked back the sting in his eyes. "It's more than enough." They returned to the lighthouse with the bottle and the note. Hector placed the bottle gently on the kitchen table while Tom laid the folded paper beside it. The room felt quieter than usual, as if even the tower understood the significance of what the sea had brought them. Tom sat down slowly. "I'll log it," Tom said. "Officially." Hector raised an eyebrow. "And what will you write?" "Pilot thanked us before vanishing into the storm." "Think the ministry wants stories like that?" Tom considered this, then shook his head. "Maybe not. But the logbook isn't for the ministry." Gavin sat across from him, hands clasped together. "Then who is it for?" Tom looked at him, his gaze steady. "For the truth. For whoever comes after us. For us." Hector snorted, but without sarcasm. "Didn't know lighthouse keepers kept history." Tom smirked faintly. "Someone has to." He opened the thick logbook, the one that had sat on the table since long before any of them had arrived, and dipped the pen in ink. He wrote the date. Then slowly, carefully, he wrote. "Found message in bottle on Western Reef." Words read, "We saw your light. Thank you." He paused, then added. "Do not know the pilot's fate. But he saw the light before the end." Gavin watched the ink dry. The words felt like a small monument, carved not in stone but in memory. When Tom closed the logbook, there was a finality to the gesture. Not of death, but of acknowledgement. The pilot had been seen. Heard. Remembered. And somehow, that mattered. That evening the three men gathered in the lantern room as the sun dipped into the sea. The sky glowed orange and pink, clouds stretched thin like watercolor strokes. For the first time in days, the horizon looked peaceful. Hector dusted off the railing. "Sea's calmer now," Hector said. "Almost gentle." Tom nodded. "Storm spent itself." Gavin rested his hands on the glass. The lighthouse lamp ticked behind them, preparing for its nightly rotation. Tom glanced at Gavin. "You did good work yesterday," Tom said. "And last night." Gavin looked down, embarrassed. "I didn't do anything." "You listened," Tom replied. "You lit the path. That's enough." Gavin breathed out slowly. "It still hurts." Tom's voice softened. "It should. If it didn't, you wouldn't be human." Hector leaned against the wall. You know, Hector said, I've been here nearly 6 years, and I've never seen a message in a bottle. Beats the usual debris we get. Gavin managed a small smile. The sun finally slipped beneath the waves. The sky dimmed. Tom lit the lamp. The great lens rotated once, catching the last of the twilight, then again, brighter this time, its beams sweeping across the darkening water like a guardian waking from sleep. Gavin watched the beam stretch out over the sea, a long white path laid over black water. We saw your light, he whispered, the words trembling from his lips. Thank you. He wasn't speaking to the pilot anymore. Not only him. He was speaking to the tower. To Tom. To Hector. And maybe, in some quiet way, to himself. Later that night, when the others were sleeping, Gavin returned to the lantern room alone. The steady hum of the machinery soothed him. He approached the window and placed a hand on the cold glass. The beam swept across the sea again. And again. Each rotation was steady. Reliable. An answered promise. Gavin closed his eyes. If you're out there, he whispered, I hope you found peace. The lighthouse answered only with light. But that was enough. Part 3, The Weight of the Light. The next few days passed in a quiet rhythm, the kind that only existed in remote places untouched by roads or towns. The lighthouse hummed, creaked, breathed. The sea rolled and sighed. And the war between nations continued far over the horizon, beyond the reach of Skerryvore's lonely beam. But something inside the tower had changed. The message in the bottle rested in a small wooden box Tom kept on the shelf above the radio. The paper was fragile, still faintly damp, but its words had etched themselves into the hearts of all 3 men. Gavin found himself glancing at the box often, not out of grief, but out of a strange, quiet comfort. It felt like a reminder that even in the darkest moments, the light they kept mattered to someone. Yet even small comforts could be shaken. 3 days after the storm, a new message crackled through the radio. Crisp, official. Not like the distressed calls they had grown used to hearing. Skerryvore Lighthouse, this is the Northern Navigational Office. Respond. Tom motioned for Gavin to sit aside and took the microphone himself. This is Skerryvore, Tom said, voice even. Go ahead. We're conducting a status check. Reports indicate heavy storm activity in your area. Any damage to equipment? No critical damage, Tom replied. Lamp functioning. Rotational mechanism steady. Generator stable. Understood, the voice said. Stand by. A short burst of static followed. Then the voice returned, slightly more rigid. Skerryvore, we also received partial recordings of radio assistance during the storm. Confirm your crew responded to pilots requesting bearing? Tom hesitated only a fraction of a second. Confirmed. We provided direction. That is within procedure, the voice answered. However, we must remind your station that lighthouse personnel are not authorized to initiate rescue operations or leave the tower during severe weather. Gavin bristled. He opened his mouth to speak, but Tom raised a hand to silence him. Confirmation received, Tom said. We remained on site. Another moment of static. Good. Maintain protocol. More storms are expected this week. That is all. The transmission ended. Tom set the microphone down. Gavin stared at him. They're checking up on us, to make sure we didn't help anyone. Tom exhaled slowly. They're checking that we stayed alive. That's not what it sounded like, Gavin argued. It sounded like they care more about rules than people. Hector, who had entered halfway through the transmission, folded his arms. Welcome to wartime bureaucracy. Cold as the rocks under our boots. Tom didn't answer immediately. He walked to the window and stared out at the patchwork sea. The daylight glimmered on the waves, soft but indifferent. The office has their job, Tom finally said. We have ours. Gavin shot back, and what is ours exactly? To light the way, or to pretend we don't hear the ones who don't make it? Tom didn't turn around. Both. And neither. Hector raised an eyebrow. Very poetic, Tom. Do you want to explain that in English? Tom rested his hands behind his back. His voice was low, pulled from a deep place. Keeping the light is a promise. But it's also a burden. It means being witness to every soul the sea takes, without being allowed to follow them in. Gavin stared at him, stunned by the raw honesty in Tom's tone. You think I like hearing those voices every night? Tom continued. You think I enjoy logging the wrecks, counting the beacons that never return? We don't choose the war. We only choose not to let the darkness swallow everything. A quiet settled on the room. Then a faint sound interrupted the tension, the soft, steady ticking of the lantern mechanism above them. The sound that meant the light hadn't stopped. And neither had they. Days softened into a calmer routine. A gentler sea. Gray skies but no thunder. For the first time since Gavin had arrived months earlier, the tower felt peaceful. But peace didn't erase the memories. One night, while Tom and Hector slept, Gavin sat alone in the radio room with the headphones on. The static was softer tonight, like the sea breathing through electricity. Gavin spun the dial slowly, listening for any signal. Then a faint voice cracked through. Bearing, need bearing. Gavin jolted. He pressed the receiver close to his ear. Can you repeat? Identify yourself. Static. Mist, engines, don't see. Then nothing. Gavin waited. The radio hissed like a whispering tide. Still nothing. He removed the headphones and sighed. False alarm. Or perhaps just distant interference. He leaned back in the chair. The dim lamplight cast long shadows across the curved walls. For a moment Gavin felt unbearably small, a single man on a rock in the middle of an endless sea, holding a light for people he'd never meet. He looked up through the small window toward the rotating beacon above. You're enough, he murmured, not sure if he believed it or if he needed to hear it aloud. The next morning brought a calm unlike any they'd seen since before the storm. The sky was pale blue, streaked with thin white clouds. The horizon lay flat and far, with a glassy smoothness across the water that felt almost unnatural after days of chaos. Hector stood outside, leaning on the railing with a mug of tea. Feels like the sea's apologizing, Hector said, taking a sip. Bit late for that, if you ask me. Tom joined him, hands tucked into his coat. The sea doesn't apologize. It forgets. Gavin stepped out next, squinting into the sunlight. It's beautiful, Gavin said, almost surprised. Hector nodded. Aye. But don't trust it. Peaceful seas are like peaceful cats, quiet because they're planning something. Gavin laughed softly. You have a metaphor for everything. That's because metaphors never break down, Hector replied, tapping the railing, unlike the generator, which I will now go threaten into working properly. Hector headed inside, muttering to himself. Gavin leaned on the railing beside Tom. Do you miss it? Gavin asked. The mainland? Tom hesitated before answering. Sometimes. But the sea teaches you something the mainland never can. What's that? Tom's voice was almost philosophical. That the world isn't shaped for your comfort. It simply is. And you must find meaning inside it, not expect it from outside. Gavin considered this. I'm trying. Tom glanced at him. You're doing better than you think. Later that afternoon, they received a radio message, this time from a civilian fishing vessel. A minor mechanical issue, far from urgent. The crew simply needed a compass bearing back to Tyree Island. Tom handled the call calmly and efficiently. Gavin watched, arms crossed, feeling something shift inside him. Not resentment. Not helplessness. Something steadier. Stronger. When the call ended, Gavin spoke. They sounded almost cheerful, Gavin said, surprised. Tom nodded. They weren't in danger. Just disoriented. But they called us anyway. Of course, Tom said. We're the light. People call the light. Gavin absorbed the words. They settled into him like stones placed carefully into a foundation. The light, Gavin repeated softly. Tom didn't need to say more. That evening, during supper, Hector placed the bottle with the pilot's message on the table, though none of them had touched it in days. I've been thinking, Hector said, rubbing his chin. About the note. About what it means for us. Tom raised an eyebrow. Go on. Well, Hector said, maybe it's time to. I don't know, display it somewhere. Gavin looked up. Display it? Hector nodded. On the wall of the lantern room. Or here in the kitchen. Somewhere we see it every day. Not tucked in a box. Tom looked conflicted. It's personal. It feels private. Hector agreed. But it's also proof. Proof that the light works. Proof that we're not useless up here. And Gavin, he nodded toward the younger man, could do with being reminded of that on bad days. Gavin's ears turned slightly red. Tom looked at the bottle again, the paper curled inside. The last words of a lost pilot. The last breath of gratitude. Slowly, Tom nodded. Very well, Tom said. We hang it in the lantern room. By the service table. Hector grinned. Good. I'll make a proper frame for it. Gavin watched them, warmth spreading through him in quiet waves. Thank you, Gavin said, voice soft. Tom met his eyes. We keep the light for everyone out there. But we also keep it for each other. Gavin blinked back emotion. Yes, he whispered. Yes, we do. Night fell again. Clear, calm, almost eerily so. Tom lit the lamp. The great beam ignited, then began its slow, eternal sweep across the sea. In the lantern room, the framed message hung neatly on the wall near the window, its 6 words small, but shining. Gavin stood in front of it, reading the words again and again. We saw your light. Thank you. He felt the meaning settle inside him like an anchor finally hitting the sea floor. Hector entered with a rag to polish the brass fittings. Looks good up there, Hector said, nodding to the frame. It does, Gavin replied. Tom joined them moments later, hands clasped behind his back. Together, they watched the light complete a full rotation. Outside, the sea reflected the beam in trembling shards. Inside, the 3 men stood quietly, linked not by duty alone, but by the shared truth of those 6 words. And for the first time in a long while, none of them felt alone. Part 4, Storm Without Voices. The calm did not last. 2 nights after the message was framed and hung on the lantern room wall, the sea awoke again. Not with the sudden violence of the earlier storm, but with a slow, tense stirring, like a giant turning in its sleep. Tom sensed it first. He always did. He stood at the base of the lighthouse stairwell, listening. Not to the wind or the waves, but to the silence between them. It's coming, Tom said, his voice low but certain. Gavin glanced up from polishing the brass lamp fittings. What is? Tom looked toward the door as a faint rumble of distant thunder rolled across the horizon. The sea's changing. Pressure's dropping. Storm within the next day. Hector groaned. I just dried out my boots. Gavin tried to joke. You could try leaving them off. Then my socks will drown, Hector said, picking up a coil of rope. And no one wants that. But even Hector's humor felt thinner tonight. A new storm meant new danger. New voices. Or worse, silence. By dusk, the clouds had thickened, layering over one another like dark wool. The horizon vanished behind a curtain of gray. The air was heavy and wet, carrying the faint metal scent that Tom always claimed was the smell of weather thinking. Gavin joined him outside on the lower gallery. The wind tugged at Gavin's coat, swirling around the lighthouse base. "It feels different," Gavin said. Tom nodded slowly. "Not as violent as the last. But unpredictable. That's sometimes worse." Gavin hugged himself against the cold. "How do you always know?" Tom gazed across the water. "You spend enough years listening to the sea, it starts speaking a language you understand." "What's it saying now?" Tom hesitated. "That it's restless. And that something's coming with it." Gavin swallowed. "Trouble?" Tom didn't smile, but his tone softened. "Trouble always comes. The question is whether we're ready for it." Night fell quickly. The lighthouse lamp ignited, its white beam slicing through the thickening air. Around midnight, the storm arrived. It did not roar, not at first. Instead, it pressed itself against the lighthouse in long, heavy bursts of wind, as if testing the walls. Rain began as a whispering drizzle, then grew sharper, pattering against the windows like urgent fingers. The sea below churned, uneasy but not yet violent. Hector paced the kitchen, unable to sit still. "Hate storms like this," Hector said. "Too quiet before the punch. Like a drunk in a pub deciding who to swing at." Tom checked the barometer again. The needle continued to drop. "It'll strengthen by dawn." Gavin sat by the radio, headphones off for now, but waiting. Hoping for nothing to happen. Fearing something would. He stared at the message on the wall, tucked safely in its frame. "We saw your light." "Thank you." It steadied him. More than he wanted to admit. The first true blast of wind hit around 1:30 a.m. The tower shuddered. A deep rumbling traveled through the stones like giant footsteps. Then a second blast came, stronger, rattling the lantern panes overhead. Hector grabbed a support beam to steady himself. "There she goes," Hector muttered. "The sea's awake now." Tom remained calm. "Gavin, stay by the radio." "Hector, with me, we check the lamp mechanics." Gavin nodded, his heartbeat quickening. He put on the headphones as the others ascended the spiral stairs. Static filled his ears immediately. Jagged, rough, restless, like the storm had injected itself into the airwaves. He turned the dial slowly. Nothing but noise. A few minutes later, Tom's voice echoed from above. "Lamp stable. Keep it steady through the rotation." "Got it," Gavin called back, though they couldn't hear him through the thick walls. Gavin listened. Silence. Static. Silence again. Hours passed slowly. The storm grew teeth, but not the sharp, violent ones of the earlier tempest. This storm growled. It heaved. It pushed at the tower with great, powerful gusts, as though trying to topple it sideways. But the lighthouse stood firm. By 3 a.m., rain slashed sideways across the glass with rhythmic fury. By 4 a.m., waves crashed hard enough to send trembling vibrations up the tower's foundation. By 5 a.m., the sky outside was as black as coal, the sea invisible beneath the storm's shifting shadows. And still, the radio stayed quiet. Too quiet. Gavin hated the quiet. Around dawn, storm still raging, Gavin heard a noise through the headphones. He straightened instantly. A crackle. A pop. A faint, something. He leaned forward, breath held. "This is Skerryvore Lighthouse," Gavin said into the mic. "If anyone can hear me, respond." Static. He waited. Then. Scare. Barely a whisper, cut off almost immediately. Gavin's pulse jumped. This is Skerryvore Lighthouse. Repeat, identify yourself. Noise. Only noise. Long waves of static rolling like wind across sand. Then again. Light, you. Gavin's heart hammered. I hear you. Identify yourself, please. But the signal dissolved. Faded. Gone. Tom and Hector appeared moments later, soaked in sweat from climbing the stairs. Tom looked at Gavin sharply. We heard shouting. What is it? Gavin removed the headphones, breath unsteady. A voice. Faint. 2 words. Light and. I think, you. And something like, scare. Maybe our name. Maybe something else. Tom considered this, jaw tensing. Pilot? Hector asked. Or ship, Gavin said. Or just interference. Or someone close enough to reach us, Hector added, voice tight. Gavin met Tom's eyes. We have to help them. Tom shook his head. We don't have a bearing. No identification. But the storm is shifting, Gavin said, stepping forward. You said yourself it wasn't as violent as before. We could take the boat. No. Tom's answer was immediate. Firm. Gavin exhaled sharply. Tom. Tom raised a hand. We are blind out there. No visibility, no signal, and no certainty anyone is even within a mile of us. Taking the boat would be suicide. Gavin's frustration bubbled. We can't just wait for another wreck to wash up. Hector stepped between them. Enough. If we launch the boat in this, we don't last 5 minutes. You know that. Gavin backed away, hands clenched. He stared at the floor, chest rising and falling. Silence stretched. Then Tom spoke again, more gently. You did what you could. If someone's out there, the light is their best chance. Gavin looked at the glowing message on the wall. We saw your light. He whispered the next word to himself. Again. The storm persisted through the entire morning. The roar of the wind drowned out nearly every other sound. The tower swayed, not dangerously, but noticeably. Water sprayed through microcracks in the lantern windows, dotting the floor with tiny shimmering droplets. The metal beams groaned. The stone walls hummed with the force of the wind. But the light never faltered. Gavin and Tom took shifts staying with the lamp, making sure the rotation remained smooth. Hector worked tirelessly in the generator room, tightening pipes, adjusting valves, urging the old machine to survive one more tempest. And still, no more voices came. Not through the radio. Not through the storm. Not through the night. By early afternoon, the storm had lost momentum. Rain softened to a drizzle. The wind fell from a howl to a growl. The waves still crashed violently, but the rhythm of the sea was no longer erratic. Tom stood at the window, hands clasped behind him. It's easing, Tom said. But slowly. Gavin sat at the radio, staring at the silent receiver. Do you think someone was really out there? Tom paused before answering. Maybe. And if they were? Tom looked at him with a tired but steady gaze. Then they saw the light. Gavin lowered his head. I wish it were more. Tom approached him and placed a hand on his shoulder, a rare gesture of comfort. You think the light is small, Tom said softly, because we keep it every day. But to someone lost in a storm, it's the whole world. Gavin didn't trust himself to speak. Hector entered with a wrench tucked under his arm. Generators humming like a choir. We'll be fine through the evening. Tom nodded. Good. The three stood together in the lantern room, watching the storm slowly pull away from the horizon. Cloud by cloud, wave by wave. Hours passed. And then. Gavin leaned forward suddenly, eyes wide. Wait. Look. Out beyond the reef, where the waves broke white against the dark stone, a small wooden object bobbed in the water, not wreckage, but something intact. A crate? A buoy? No. A box. A sealed wooden box. Tom inhaled sharply. The tide's bringing it in. Hector grabbed a rope. We can reach it once it hits the inner reef. Gavin rushed for his coat. Let's go. Tom's voice stopped him. Slowly. The rocks are still slick. They descended the ladder cautiously. The wind blew strong but no longer menacing. Rain misted their coats. The sea roared against the reef as the wooden box scraped closer, riding the waves like a stubborn survivor. When it finally struck the rocks, Hector reached out with the hooked rope and snagged it. Gavin helped haul it onto the reef while Tom steadied them both. The box was battered. Waterlogged. Heavy. But it was intact. Open it, Gavin said, breathless. Hector pried it open with his knife. Inside, wrapped in thick oilcloth, was a metal container marked with faded letters. Tom brushed the cloth aside. A delivery box from a coastal observation post. Tom frowned. These are used for message drops. Gavin felt his heart pound. Tom opened the metal container. Inside was a single note. He unfolded it carefully, hands wet, breath tight. The message read. Light seen during storm. Could not reach you. Saved course. Heading home. Gavin's eyes widened. Saved course. Someone made it through, Hector whispered. Gavin closed his eyes, overwhelmed. They had not heard the last transmission. Because the pilot, or ship crew, had already regained control. Tom shook his head in disbelief. They were close. Closer than I thought. Gavin exhaled shakily. The light saved them. Tom put a steadying hand on his shoulder. No, Tom said softly, you saved them. That night, the storm finally died completely. The sky cleared just enough to reveal a sliver of moonlight. The sea settled. The air grew still. In the lantern room, the framed message glowed faintly in the lamplight. Now there were 2 messages. 2 survivors. 2 proofs of hope. Tom stood beside Gavin and Hector as the lamp rotated once more, its beam stretching across the calm sea. Gavin looked at the framed paper, then at the new note Tom had placed beside it. His voice was steady. Maybe the light is enough. Tom nodded. It always was. Hector crossed his arms with a rare smile. And so are we. The 3 men watched the horizon together. Not for voices. Not for wreckage. But simply for the ones who might see the light, and find their way home. Part 5, The Light That Remains. The storm had passed, but its memory lingered in the waves. 2 days after the wooden message box washed ashore, the sea was calmer than it had been in months. The water shimmered silver beneath a pale sun, and gulls circled lazily overhead, crying out in tones that felt almost peaceful. Inside the lighthouse, something felt different. Something lighter. The 2 messages, we saw your light. Thank you, and light seen during storm. Saved course. Heading home. Now hung side by side in the lantern room. Framed. Protected. Revered. Every time Gavin climbed the stairs, he paused to read them. Not because he needed reassurance. But because they had become part of him. Tom made tea that morning, humming quietly, a habit he rarely indulged. Hector was at the table carving a small wooden plaque to place beneath the frames. What are you carving? Gavin asked, setting down a coil of rope. A dedication, Hector replied. Something small. Something fitting. Tom raised an eyebrow as he poured the tea. What's it say? Hector cleared his throat dramatically. It says, to the ones who saw our light. Gavin smiled softly. It's perfect. Tom nodded approvingly. You've outdone yourself, Hector. Hector shrugged. Well, someone has to add class to this tower. Gavin laughed. The lighthouse felt warmer these days. Not physically, the sea breeze still cut through the walls, but emotionally. As if the storm had scrubbed away some invisible weight. Tom noticed it too. He watched Gavin move through the tower with a steadiness that had not been there before. A confidence that wasn't born from pride, but from purpose. That afternoon, the radio crackled unexpectedly, not with distress, but with the smooth tone of a naval officer. Skerryvore Lighthouse, this is Coastal Command Patrol Plane 9. Checking range visibility. Please respond. Gavin answered. Patrol Plane 9, we read you. Visibility moderate. Beam rotation stable. Good to hear, the pilot replied. We're passing 20 miles south. Wanted to give you a thank you for the last storm. Gavin blinked. Thank us? Affirmative. We had 2 flights out that night that used your light to correct their heading. Might have lost them otherwise. Gavin glanced at Tom, eyes wide. Tom nodded for him to continue. You're welcome, Gavin said, though his voice shook slightly. You boys keep that thing shining, the pilot said. You've saved more lives than you know. The transmission ended. Silence filled the room. Then Hector grinned. Well. How about that? Gavin sat down slowly, letting the words settle. Tom clapped a firm hand on his shoulder. Evidence keeps piling up, Tom said. And you thought the light wasn't enough. Gavin exhaled. I didn't understand it then. And now? Tom asked. Gavin looked up at him. Now I do. As evening approached, the sky blushed with soft purples and golds. The sea reflected the warm colors, and for the first time in many days, Skerryvore looked less like a lonely outpost and more like a guardian tower standing proud at the edge of the world. Gavin walked to the lantern room with a bucket of cleaning cloths. The glass panes, still dotted with dried salt spray from the storm, needed tending. He climbed the narrow steps and entered the room. The lens rotated with its familiar slow rhythm. The mechanism clicked and hummed, steady as a heartbeat. Gavin walked to the frames. He looked at the first message, the one in the bottle. We saw your light. Thank you. He looked at the second message, the one from the box. Light seen during storm. Saved course. Heading home. Both were small moments. Small gestures. Small proofs. But together, they meant everything. Tom joined him quietly at the window. The two stood side by side, watching the sea darken as night settled over the horizon. You've changed, Tom said, not unkindly. Gavin smiled faintly. For the better, I hope. For the wiser, Tom replied. Wiser is better. Gavin nodded. I used to think helping meant taking action. Doing something dramatic. Running out into storms. Tom kept his gaze on the waves. Many men think that. Most grow out of it. Some never do. Gavin looked down at his hands. I thought if we weren't pulling people from the water, then we were failing. Tom turned to face him. His expression was gentle, but firm. Sometimes action is holding steady. Sometimes helping is staying where you must be, not where you want to be. Gavin swallowed. And the light is enough. Tom placed a hand on the frame beside them. Often more than enough. The beam swept across the room. Across the sea. Across the night. Later, as the sky deepened into darkness, Hector lit a small oil lamp in the kitchen. He opened the logbook and wrote a simple entry. Storm passed. Messages recovered. Lives saved. He paused, tapping the pen against his chin. Then he added. Light continues. He closed the book with a soft thump. Upstairs, Tom resumed his watch. Downstairs, Gavin took a moment to sit by the radio, not because he expected distress calls, but because he found peace in the quiet static. He removed the headphones and looked around at the curved stone walls. This place had once felt like a prison of duty. Now it felt like a calling. And then the radio crackled. Gavin straightened. Skerryvore light, this is Fisher vessel Rowan Tree. Visibility low. Requesting bearing to Tyree. Gavin smiled. He leaned in and answered calmly, with confidence he had earned. Rowan Tree, this is Skerryvore. Turn 15 degrees starboard for 3 miles. You should see the coastline. Copy that, Skerryvore. And thank you. Clear seas. Gavin set the microphone down. Tom's voice echoed from the stairs. Good call. You heard that? Gavin asked. Every word, Tom said, stepping into the room. You sound like a keeper. Gavin grinned. I guess I am. Tom nodded. A good one. That night, just before midnight, the lighthouse glowed with a calm, steady brilliance. The waves were gentle. The stars stretched across the sky like tiny lanterns hung above the world. Gavin sat outside on the gallery, wrapped in his coat, breathing the cold sea air. Tom joined him quietly. Hector followed, carrying a small tin mug of tea for each of them. They stood together in silence. Below them, the lighthouse's beam swept across the water. Far out on the horizon, faint but certain, a distant ship blinked its running lights, like a firefly in the dark. Gavin lifted his mug slightly. To them, Gavin said. Whoever they are. Hector raised his mug. To them. Tom lifted his last. To those who see the light. Their mugs clinked quietly in the cold air. Then they drank. Hours later, Gavin climbed to the lantern room one last time before sleeping. The lamp filled the chamber with warm light. The glass panes glowed. The metal fittings shimmered. The 2 framed messages hung side by side, perfectly still. Gavin touched the edge of the first frame gently. You mattered, he whispered to the pilot who had written the words. Then he touched the second. And so did you. He stepped back and looked at both. 2 messages. 2 lives. 2 moments of connection across storms, distance, and darkness. Then he looked out over the vast sea through the lantern glass. You were right, Tom, Gavin said quietly, even though Tom wasn't there. Keeping the light is everything. He stood there until the lamp made another full rotation. The beam swept across the horizon. Across the unknown. Across every place where someone might be searching. The lighthouse answered the darkness with brightness. And Gavin knew, without doubt, without hesitation, that his purpose was no longer in question. He would keep the light. For the lost. For the found. For the frightened. For the hopeful. For anyone who needed to know someone was still out there. For as long as he lived, he would keep the light. Morning came gently. A soft orange glow touched the waves. The sea sparkled like glass. The wind carried only a faint whisper, no longer burdened by storms. Tom brewed tea again, a ritual of peace. Hector polished the brass rails. Gavin wiped down the lantern glass until it shined like a jewel. They worked together in an easy harmony. Then the radio crackled again, a calm, clipped voice. Skerryvore, this is Coastal Office. Routine check. Any unusual activity to report? Tom looked at Gavin. Gavin looked at Tom. Tom pressed the microphone. No unusual activity, Tom said. All lights steady. All calm. He paused. Then added. And the sea is quiet today. There was a brief silence on the other end. Good to hear it, Skerryvore. Carry on. Tom set down the microphone, then turned to Gavin. You know, Tom said, the sea never stays quiet long. I know, Gavin replied, a peaceful smile on his face. And when it isn't, we'll be ready. Hector entered with the framed plaque he'd carved. Where should I hang it? Tom gestured toward the lantern room. By the messages. Hector nodded. Good place. The three ascended the stairs together. At the top, in the lantern room filled with morning light, they hung the small wooden plaque beneath the two messages. Its carved letters glowed warmly in the rising sun. To those who saw our light. Gavin took a deep breath. Tom placed a hand on his shoulder. Hector stepped forward and whispered, to the next ones. And together, as the day began, the lighthouse keepers of Skerryvore turned to the window, and watched their light sweep out across the endless sea. A promise. A beacon. A guide. A light that would never go out.